This is the second part of a two-part workshop series on developing partner communication strategies with recipients of person-directed planning who use augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. This first workshop provides an overview of augmentative and alternative communication, defining key concepts and providing examples of the most common types of AAC. The term partner communication strategies refers to a set of tactics that planning facilitators develop along with the planning recipient and members of their circle of support to guide communication throughout the planning process. This workshop outlines a 5-phase process for identifying and breaking down communication barriers that might otherwise prevent an AAC user from taking an active role in person-directed planning. This process is based on established best practices in AAC and transition planning for persons with disabilities. The phases are as follows. Pre-phase 1, set up the initial meeting with the planning recipient and their key communication partners. Phase 1, conduct the initial meetings with the planning recipient and their key communication partners. Phase 2, gather context-specific information on the planning recipient's use of AAC. Phase 3, develop the preliminary PDP partner communication strategies. Phase 4, gather feedback on the preliminary PDP partner communication strategies from the planning recipient and their core circle of support. Phase 5, get approval on the final PDP partner communication strategies. It is important that planning facilitators take note of some considerations around implementing this process. Firstly, this process is meant to be implemented during the pre-planning stage of the overall person-directed planning process. The purpose of the pre-planning stage, sometimes referred to as the planning assessment period, is to learn about the strengths and needs of the planning recipient, to build rapport, and to establish a core circle of support. A necessary task for planning facilitators in the pre-planning stage is to develop a solid understanding of the communication strengths and needs of the planning recipient. Secondly, if the planning recipient has not used AAC as a primary means of communication within the past 6 months, this process might not be the most effective approach to understanding their communication strengths and needs. That being said, if the planning recipient would benefit from using an AAC system or methods that they have not used within the past 6 months, the planning facilitator should consider a re-referral to the initial AAC prescriber before proceeding with the pre-planning stage. Now let's begin with the process of creating partner communication strategies with planning recipients who use AAC. The objective of pre-phase 1 is to set up the initial meeting with the planning recipient and their key communication partners. These are the people that the planning recipient communicates with most frequently and will likely include close family members, support workers, and friends. The first task in pre-phase 1 is to review all the information received through the referral process, including notes from the initial contact with the planning recipient or their primary designate. A primary designate is a person who can answer certain questions on behalf of the planning recipient and is usually a close family member, friend, or hired support worker. When reviewing this initial information, determine whether or not the planning recipient currently uses AAC as a primary means of communication, the type or various types of AAC that the planning recipient uses, and if your initial information contains any assessments or reports relevant to the planning recipient's use of AAC. The screening tools for information on AAC usage kit provides checklists that are helpful in screening for this information. For detailed instructions and examples of how to use these checklists, download the screening tools for information on AAC usage kit from the same webpage on which you launched this workshop. If your initial information is not sufficient to complete the checklists, they should be completed during your initial meeting with the planning recipient in phase 1. Next, you will make contact with the planning recipient or a designate to set up the initial meeting and to explain its purpose. There are 3 primary objectives for the initial meeting. 1. to gather preliminary information on the planning recipient's use of AAC. 2. To provide an overview of the 5-phase process for creating the PDP partner communication strategies. 3. To initiate the 5-phase process. Once you have explained the purpose of the meeting, you are ready to set a time and date to actually meet. Be sure to set the meeting at a location or venue of the planning recipient's choice, and to encourage the planning recipient to invite key communication partners and, where applicable, communication facilitators to attend the meeting. To clarify, a key communication partner is someone who often communicates with the planning recipient and who knows their communication style quite well, while a communication facilitator is someone who supports the planning recipient in their efforts to communicate with others. The planning recipient is most likely to communicate effectively in a familiar setting while surrounded by individuals who are knowledgeable about their communication style and who can support their communication efforts. Before finalizing a time and date for the initial meeting, ensure that the planning recipient consents to attend. If the planning recipient does not communicate via telephone, TTY, video phone, or email, and your initial contact was with a designate, consent should be sought from the planning recipient in an in-person meeting. The objective of Phase 1 is to conduct the initial meeting, or series of meetings, with the planning recipient and their key communication partners as a means of gathering preliminary information about how the planning recipient uses AAC in different contexts. Open the initial meeting with an overview of the principles of person-directed planning and a discussion about the various topics included in a person-directed plan. Creating a Good Life in Community is a great resource to guide this initial discussion and can be downloaded directly from the Ministry of Community and Social Services website. Next, explain the 5-phase process for developing PDP partner communication strategies with the planning recipient. Page 9 of the guidebook provides a solid overview of this process and can be used to guide this discussion. Make sure to clarify that the process is part of the pre-planning stage of the overall planning process and is meant to address communication barriers that might otherwise prevent the planning recipient from taking an active role within the planning stage. Having communication strategies in place for the planning stage will improve the probability of meaningful communication between the planning recipient and the rest of the core circle of support, encouraging choice-making and self-determination. Once you have finished explaining the process, you are ready to initiate it. Start by gathering general information regarding the planning recipient's current use of AAC. Use the current AAC usage checklist to gather this information from the planning recipient and members of their circle of support. Next, use the initial context-specific AAC information checklist to identify the 3 to 4 communication contexts in which the planning recipient uses AAC most frequently. Request permission from the planning recipient or an appropriate designate to interview key communication partners and, where applicable, communication facilitators in each of the communication contexts identified. In addition, request permission to conduct direct observations of the planning recipient in each of these contexts. Before proceeding, make sure to obtain written consent from the planning recipient or an appropriate designate for the release of additional assessments or documents of relevance identified in the AAC Assessments Reports Checklist, to interview primary communication partners and facilitators in each of the identified communication contexts, and to conduct your direct observations of the planning recipient. If the planning recipient or designate refuses consent for any of the above, propose alternative options for gathering context-specific information on their use of AAC. The objective of Phase 2 is to gather context-specific information on the planning recipient's use of AAC through targeted interviews and direct observation. This is the most involved phase of the process. However, before starting your observations and interviews, it is important to obtain all additional assessments and relevant documents identified in Phase 1. These documents will provide you with expert perspectives on the planning recipient's communication and other relevant strengths and needs. Review all documentation as well as your notes from the initial meeting or series of meetings with the planning recipient. If clarification is needed on any of the documents, contact the person who originally completed them. Now you are ready to begin gathering more in-depth information on the planning recipient's use of AAC in different communication contexts. Begin by contacting key communication partners for each of the communication contexts identified in Phase 1. Remember, you will have obtained the relevant contact information while completing Phase 1 templates. Interview each of the identified communication partners using the Communication Contexts Interview Observation Checklist. Towards the end of each interview, set up an appointment to observe the planning recipient communicating in that particular communication context. Inquire as to the most appropriate time for your observations and if any additional consents or permissions are required. Where applicable, be sure to contact and interview the planning recipient's key communication facilitators for each of the identified communication contexts. Arrive at the communication contexts for which you have set appointments and conduct your observations of the planning recipient. The Communication Context Interview Observation Checklist is your reference point for observations. However, try to capture as much relevant information as possible and do not limit your observations to the categories listed in the checklist. These direct observations are invaluable and will shape your understanding of the planning recipient's use of AAC. Once you have finished your observations and interviews, collate all your information in preparation for Phase 3. The objective of Phase 3 is to develop a preliminary set of partner communication strategies based on the information you have collected in the previous phases. Your first task in this phase is to analyze the information gathered in Phase 2 in relation to suggestions listed in the Considerations Matrix. For detailed instructions on how to use the Considerations Matrix, please download the AAC Considerations Matrix for Person-Directed Planning Toolkit from the same webpage on which you launched this workshop. After you have considered the suggestions listed in the Communications Matrix, begin developing your preliminary partner communication strategies for each of the topics listed in the PDP Partner Communication Strategies template. Examples of completed templates are included in the AAC Considerations Matrix for Person-Directed Planning Toolkit. The objective of Phase 4 is to gather feedback on the preliminary set of PDP Partner Communication Strategies from the planning recipient and their circle of support. This phase should consist of one meeting. Begin by setting a time and date for the meeting with the planning recipient or an appropriate designate. Explain that the purpose of the meeting is to review the preliminary partner communication strategies that you have developed. Consider sharing the preliminary strategies with the planning recipient and members of their circle of support via email prior to the meeting. This will give the planning recipient and others a chance to think about their impressions of your proposed strategies and to prepare suggestions for revisions and relevant comments in advance of the meeting. Encourage the planning recipient or designate to include all persons that were interviewed in Phase 2. This will help to expand the circle of support beyond persons immediately involved in the planning recipient's life. Make sure that the planning recipient consents to have additional persons attend the meeting. Begin the meeting by presenting your preliminary PDP partner communication strategies to the planning recipient and their circle of support. Be sure to document all feedback and suggestions. Remember, the purpose of the meeting is for the planning recipient and their circle of support to critique your preliminary strategies, so be open to constructive criticism and actively solicit the feedback of everyone in the meeting. After you have finished gathering feedback on the preliminary guidelines, estimate the amount of time that will be necessary to make your revisions. Set a follow-up meeting for review of the revised PDP partner communication strategies. The objective of Phase 5 is to get approval on the final version of the PDP partner communication strategies. Start by revising your preliminary strategies based on the feedback you received in Phase 4 and creating a final version. Present this final draft of the strategies to the planning recipient and their circle of support. Describe how you addressed their feedback in your revisions. Gather consensus around the revised strategies and establish the final draft as the ground rules for communication throughout the PDP process. Now you are ready to start the planning phase of the person-directed planning process.